This is an ISOC England webinar on the policy framework for an open and trusted internet. We had a webinar that took place about a month ago that was looking at the input for a European chapters meeting that took place on the 22nd and 23rd of February on this specific topic, looking at ethical data handling, privacy, data breaches, examples of collaborative security, Internet of Things, digital literacy, etc. Lots of things. In fact, a copy of the recording is available on our website if you're interested in this, if you've missed that. But today we are again with Ansgar Kerner, who was our representatives in the European chapters meeting. And he is going to be talking to us today about what happened at that European chapters meeting and providing us with a follow-up on the discussions that took place there, an update. And I guess that after that, we can then think about what are our next steps as a chapter. Our next steps also with the Internet Society, the other European chapters as well. And I do welcome members of other chapters who are joining us on this call. And of course, members of other chapters who are probably going to watch this. We will record, we are recording this webinar, and you will be able to consult this at your own pace. Anyway, without any further ado, then please, Ansgar Kerner, welcome. Thank you for having represented the English chapter, or the UK chapter at, in Amsterdam at this important meeting. And yes, we're really looking forward to hear from you. So over to you, Ansgar.
Okay, thank you, Olivier. And it was my pleasure to represent ISOC UK England at the European chapters meeting. And so for myself, it was a very good experience. I learned a lot about what the rest of the other chapters are doing and how very motivated a lot of them are. I'm going to do a presentation that sort of summarizes the points. Most of them are it's notes that were taken by Marit during the meeting, summarizing the outcomes of the various discussions. So I'll just switch over to sharing that presentation now, if I can. Okay, did that work? Try and get it.
Yeah, we can see your screen now.
Okay. So we had basically 5 main sort of content type of discussions. I've slightly regrouped them in topical order as opposed to the temporal order they were presented in. And so we had 3 effectively dealing with questions around securities, so data breach report, collaborative security, and security of IoT devices. And then we had 2 that were focusing more on things connected to the fake news types of issues. So search ranking technologies, how does Google decide what comes high on the ranking and to what extent is that gameable? And editorial responsibility for online content, which was really actually focusing more on fake news kind of questions. What are the causes? Is fake news a singular kind of thing or not? And to what extent is it useful to try and tackle it as a single kind of topic? And then we had a roundup of some of the national agendas on trust in Europe. I'm not completely sure if I included those in the slide deck right now, actually. And some of the activities and actions that were discussed for things to come up. There was also a presentation by the Dutch ISOC going into some more details of what they were doing, but due to time considerations, I've not included that right now. The slides, I believe, are available. I don't know right now exactly where the address is, where you find those. So to go into these points, so the first one was on the data breach report. So there was a report by ISOC, which is available at the website you can see there, discussing data breaches and how those are being reported on, and the trends that exist in that. So if you actually go to the report, it will provide quite a lot of survey data on the trends and also some action recommendations. So the sort of the distilled version of that was that users are increasingly concerned about data breaches. One of the problems with data breaches is that the cost of breaches is generally not borne by those who should have protected the data. So often, if data is lost, a company's database gets accessed, the people who really bear the cost of that are the individuals. They need to perhaps apply for new credit cards, do all kinds of things to counteract the potential threats to them that are caused by this breach of personal data, whereas the source whose database got accessed has minimal immediate costs related to it. Another aspect that came out strongly within the report is the need to increase transparency. There should be a mandatory breach reporting, because at this moment it is the priorities around security of data are not really that high, often due to a lack of accountability. So if companies have to admit to it, have to report the fact that the data was being accessed, they will have a stronger incentive to improve this. And it will also make it easier for people, for users, to know whether or not a particular provider is a safe provider or not. And another big aspect that's increasingly contributing to data breaches is the inadequate security of IoT devices. And we'll be going into that in more detail on the talk that was really focusing on IoT. So following from these data points that were presented in the data breach report, during the discussion at the meeting, one of the main things really that was picked up on is that the GDPR really covers a lot of the issues that were being raised. For instance, the mandatory data breach notification is included in the GDPR. The higher kinds of fines that you can get for not having a good data privacy standard in protocol within your company is also part of the GDPR and will contribute to better data protection issues. So really, one of the main things that came out of the discussion is that if it comes to data breach issues, we really need to be looking at the GDPR and also the Network and Information Securities Directive, the NIS Directive, which are coming into effect soonish, as in GDPR, it's in May 2018. So one of the questions is, what kind of a role should ISOC take in this? So one of the issues with the GDPR, for instance, is that a lot of companies are saying that they're not really sure as to what their new responsibilities are going to be. There's going to be lots of new responsibilities, but it's very difficult in understanding it. So potentially ISOC could take a role in the education around implementation. Another sort of observation that came out of the discussion was that data breaches, from the perspective of government, data breaches really become a priority once human lives are at risk, which is unfortunate, but probably true. There might be regulation changes. No. So an observation was that when regulation does change, for instance, the introduction of the GDPR, this can change the market and produce new opportunities. Within the whole issue of how data is being protected, standards are important. They are an important measure, important to measure the market development. So if you look at what kind of standards currently exist or don't exist, you get an idea about how mature the market is. And the one issue that was raised is that currently standards are really understood only by a small kind of body of people, specialized people. So potentially standards bodies should become knowledge hubs that people could approach to get information about how they should be doing things better. So it might be a potential action point around that. There was the observation that the existence of regulation and standards don't remove duty of care of citizens. So you can't just say, well, there was a regulation, so now I can freely click on every link that comes around and hope that my computer is going to be secure. Things like that. And the observation of probably cybersecurity insurance is going to be a growing market. There's already some things happening there, and probably is going to increase quite a lot in the future. So that was really sort of the summary of the discussion on data breach report. And then closely connected to that was the next presentation on collaborative security. So collaborative security is all about...
Ansgar,
yes.
Yeah, it's Olivier here, just quickly jumping here. Since we're dealing with more than one report, do you want to take the questions completely at the end, or do you want to take the questions on each report in turn?
Well, we could actually, maybe it's better if we do them per report, because otherwise it'll be too long.
I thought per report would be a good thing. Otherwise, we'll start mixing things around and stuff. So, let's then open the floor for questions first. Then for this first report, the data breach report. Are there any questions? Now, in order to ask questions, you may do either one of two things. Either you can write a question in uppercase in the chat and then ask your question, and I'll relay it to the webinar, and Ansgar will be able to respond. Or you can ask for the floor either by typing hand up in the chat or putting your hand up using a system where when you show the participants, you've got the ability, it's just under the participants list, there is a thing that you can press and it will put the hand up, and I'll see your hand up, and then I can give you the floor. Either one of those two is fine. So are there any questions to Ansgar on this first thing? And I've noticed that Jeff has asked what the question protocol was, so I wonder whether he has a question. Jeff, do you want to be the first one to take the floor?
Yeah, in the context of a data breach and notification and transparency, was there any discussion around, apart from the fine system that GDPR puts in place, was there any discussion around the right of remedy of the individual with the organization? Because that's a fundamental building block of trust in digital engagement, and the legislation doesn't require it. So I'm just interested as to whether or not the ISOC community feels that there's an opportunity to create an ethical driver to something beyond basic regulatory compliance.
There was not really a discussion on that in relation to the data breach report. Was something somewhat similar did come up around the IoT discussion later. And I guess it connects also to the question of standards, perhaps not exactly standards issue, but insofar as it's a voluntary kind of action taken on by the suppliers. But no, it wasn't really discussed on this particular topic.
Okay, thanks for this, Ansgar. Thanks for the question, Jeff. Are there any other questions? I don't see anyone putting their hand up here. I know several more people have made it on the call as well, so welcome to you. Welcome to you as well. And let's go back to you, Ansgar, then. Seeing no further hands. Let me just put Jeff's hand further back down, and that's it. Yeah, let's go back to you, Ansgar, for the next part.
Okay, so the second presentation was on collaborative security. So this is really the issue that for good internet security, you're really depending on each other. An obvious strong example for that is the, at least for people in the UK, it was the hack of TalkTalk, which, if I'm not mistaken, was a case of actually one of their suppliers having weak security. They got hacked, and because the supplier had a certain level of access to TalkTalk's data system, and the hackers managed to get in via that route. So good internet security is really a question of collaborative efforts. We all get more secure if everybody else is secure, and less secure if anybody else is not secure. Actually, I think Richard mentioned something about if anybody who's connecting to the Wi-Fi network that we're all connected to has a compromised computer, then that is potentially a route for them to compromise everyone else who's on that network. So collaborative security, a shared common goal, which requires a kind of consensus in identifying what the problems are and what kind of solutions to pursue for that, which has an outward perspective of distributed security in the hyper-connected world, so having security at each of the various points, and it contributes to resilience, so being proactive versus reactive, having incremental solutions, and being able to learn from lessons. So if for instance, connecting to the previous issue with the data breach report of people not reporting about the fact that they got breached, that means they're not contributing any lessons. They're not allowing other people to learn from the lessons that they've learned from being hacked. So in a collaborative security environment, you need this kind of transparency. So local actions have a global impact because of producing safe neighborhoods, and among internet invariants is the need for an open and evolving internet. So one of the, on that last point, the internet, I just took over this slide from the presentation, was present as the internet is an open and interconnected and interdependent, which sort of implicitly already brings out the fact that you need to have collaborative efforts in order to really get a secure kind of system. So let me just check my notes briefly. Yes. So on the collaborative security, really one of the main points, actually why this was brought up, was the call for some more examples around successful collaborative security, because that's something that ISOC wants to collect in order to be able to promote this as something that needs to be pursued. So clear case studies that bring out the effectiveness of collaborative security or the ineffectiveness of not doing so, and the kind of global impact that they have on the properties of the internet. I have to admit that on the examples of collaborative security, I don't actually know what the CSIRT and the MANRS, the MANRS actually stand for. And that's not really my range of expertise. Does anybody else who happens to be online at this moment know what these are?
I don't see anyone waving or putting the hand up, so sorry. I'm aware of the CSIRTs, but not the MANRS.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what is the CSIRTs?
It's Computer Systems Incident Response Teams.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Or Computer Systems or Computer Security Incidents Response Team. It depends. It's one or the other.
Okay.
But it's equivalent to the CERTs, Computer Emergency Response Teams, and the CERTs were established in the late 80s, the first one being in, I think it was Lehigh University. Was it Lehigh? Anyway, it was a while ago. Then they had CERTs a bit everywhere, and CSIRTs are now with the incident response. So really just security people that will be there if things really do go wrong, then they'll take action and they'll be able to coordinate. And there's a whole network of people that will, so they'll have each other's phone numbers and so on, and they'll be able to use the another way to correspond with each other in case things really do go south on the internet. And that obviously brings the, that is, I guess, an example of collaborative security. But sorry, back to you, Edgar.
No, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a good example of collaborative security because the people actually on the teams are funded, are supplied by other organizations that, or big companies that can afford them. And then when necessary, they can jump in and collectively help to solve problems for potentially people groups who wouldn't be able to have these kinds of experts on board usually.
And it's Olivier here again, and just jumping in, I note that Jeff has written in the chat that MAN-RS is a routing protocol for sharing security incidents, usually on mutually agreed norms for routing security. That's what it is.
Okay. Thank you. So as I said, sort of one of the core things around the collaborative security presentation was really this call for some case studies that could very nicely highlight the effectiveness of collaborative security methods as part of the general push to try and make the community of internet users more aware and more proactive in the sense of generating these collaborative methods, because we are all dependent on each other as far as getting an actual secure system, secure internet. So therefore, we need to support the growth of more collaborative methods. There was a call during the meeting for some examples, but unfortunately nobody really came up with an example at the spot. So it's really a exercise to take home and work on. So maybe this could be something that we should take up as ISAC UK as well. That's it really for this particular topic. Are there any further questions on this one?
Now let's open the floor. It's Olivier speaking. Any questions from anyone on this topic of collaborative security? Just one more thing to add. This is really a main topic now for the Internet Society headquarters. They really are completely behind it, and it's something which they're going to continue developing. They started with that paper on collaborative security, which is referenced, of course, in our web page on the ISOC England website. But it's a starting point, and I gather that this is something, and I hope that this is something that the chapter, the UK chapter, will be able to take up. And I guess we could be one of the main players and main component parts of the not only discussion, but the development of collaborative security systems. So I don't see anyone asking questions or making comments. Therefore, back to you, Ansgar.
Okay. So coming now to the security of IoT devices, and this ended up being one of the more active and longer discussions, which actually could have gone on quite a bit longer, but had to be cut off because there were other things to discuss on the day. So security of IoT devices, really it's one of the main concerns in the area of the IoT. And so the presentation really started with an observation that during Christmas, lots of people would have received all kinds of devices devices, and he seemed to observe that his mother had received like 5 devices that in one way or another could be classified as IoT devices, making her by now an admin of more than 20 IoT type of devices. And obviously she has no real understanding of how to do that. And sort of it started with the observation that as a computer person, probably most ISOC members will end up being the person that has to troubleshoot all of these devices when they visit any of their relatives. So IoT security, consumers are not aware of how home automation works. They don't understand it, and they don't really care. And as a consequence, they don't really care about the IoT security. Most people will get their device, the gift or the thing that they bought in the store, they'll take it out of the box and plug it in. And unless there is a requirement for you to do things like resetting a password, because the device won't work unless you've done the password reset, most likely devices will just get plugged in and used with whatever default they came with. So this was one of the big problems. We know, for instance, because things like the IoT botnets, the Karna and the Mirai botnets, have used the basic security vulnerabilities in IoT, like these hard-coded default admin logins of open devices. And for instance, the Karna network, which scanned potential open IoT devices that could be hacked back in 2012 already, and made the list of all of these vulnerabilities publicly visible. Most or a big proportion of the things that were listed have not been solved, the vulnerabilities have not been closed. So IoT devices, because they're of this type, they're not like the common PC where you get a visual reminder from your operating system vendor that says, please update your system. They're a device that gets put somewhere in the house and has probably no display on it at all. Unless you plug it into something else, you can't really do any firmware updates, etc. Vulnerabilities that exist at time of sale often remain within the system, and users who are not tech-savvy people will not apply the patch even if it comes out. So then there was just sort of what kind of an impact have things like the IoT botnet-based attacks, for instance, the recent one using the Mirai network attacking the Dyn server, what kind of impact have they had on user trust? So observations were things like breakdown of communication channels during the time of the attack, things like Twitter, Facebook, etc. weren't accessible, but as a consequence, because these things are also being used as authentication, you log into other services with a Facebook account and stuff. That kind of authentication method wasn't working, causing further potential vulnerabilities. And there was the observation that somebody said they observed that because when they were using their phone, as they would usually do with the phone, their app, they were trying to access a website. The website was actually down because of the botnet attack, but they just assumed that their phone was broken. So you can have knock-on effects of people starting to blame other kinds of devices just because things are interdependent on each other. And of course, there was a huge loss of revenue by the various companies whose systems were no longer accessible because the domain name server was being attacked by the hacked IoT devices. So basically what this means, we've got a multi-stakeholder kind of problem, which will need a multi-stakeholder kind of approach to solve. Everybody is really affected by having this kind of vulnerabilities. So this led to a kind of overview of the types of security needs that arise. And this was based apparently on content from Olaf Koltman's blog for a certain extent, at least. So one thing is that producers need to follow and share good design practices. At this moment, too many producers of IoT devices are not following good design practices. Security researchers need to be able to responsibly disclose vulnerabilities. There needs to be a system set up for that. And they need to not be potential for them to get prosecuted for disclosing vulnerability. Then producers that can fix vulnerabilities need to make sure that they can fix vulnerabilities during the lifetime of devices, a field upgradability. So one of the problems with a lot of IoT devices, that, as I said, they get shipped and then they get placed somewhere, and it can be very difficult to actually do the patching of any vulnerability. So the manufacturers need to have a way to push patches out to the devices. There needs to be clarity of what happens if a product or the producer reaches end of life. This is a different kind of problem that, because IoT devices will be more like other kinds of objects and machines and things like that you use around the house, they tend not to get, they tend to have a life cycle that is longer than the 1 or 2 years of a lot of software or things like mobile phones, which means there's much higher risk that potentially the producer of the webcam or the other kind of device may stop being in business. And then what happens to the device? Does the device simply not work anymore? Does your IoT connected fridge suddenly stop working because the company that it was delivered by is no longer building this particular model, and therefore now suddenly your fridge doesn't cool anymore? So admittedly, that's not particularly a security problem specifically, but it can also have connection to security issues, because obviously if the producer doesn't produce this kind of thing anymore, it won't be sending out patches for particular vulnerabilities either. Then there's the issue of transparency, that consumers need to be able to make informed choices based on real evaluation between the cost versus the security trade-offs. So that would require that the IoT devices have some kind of a safety test done on them, and that consumers can know what the safety levels of the security levels of the IoT device are. Data that IoT devices collect needs to be protected and dealt with in a privacy-honoring way. This, of course, also connects into the issue of if the system gets hacked. If a lot of data is being collected, then that becomes an extra concern. And then there was the concept that irresponsible device security should get penalized in order to really motivate increased security. I'm just thinking, because this particular one is a bit longer, potentially if somebody has a question that is highly pertinent to one of the current slides, it might also be useful to just flag up at that point of time before I move to the next one.
Yeah, it's Olivier speaking. Thank you, Ansgar. I see Jeff has got his hand up. So Jeff, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Were there any discussions around the issues of consent for the collection of personal data in the context of the IoT, which of course is quite an interesting challenge when what we're talking about mostly is devices that don't have screens and input-output capacity for engaging with the individual to obtain their consent prior to data collection, which they're sensing?
It's a very good point. It was not discussed at the meeting because the focus was more on, I think, the question of IoT device vulnerability to being hacked. It's a very good point that the traditional sort of approach of the bunch of texts that will tell you what your terms of and conditions are, that you then have to tick a box on, that kind of model doesn't really work. I would not be too surprised if the fallback is going to be something like the shrink wrap. As soon as you open the packaging of the IoT device, you have consented to the data sharing, and then it'll be small print on the back of the package or something. It was not discussed specifically within the context of IoT. I think it was more thought of as these kinds of failure of communicating sufficiently to people how their data is being used is an endemic problem among so many services, and that just also applies to IoT.
I just thought it might be worth making people aware. I'm aware of a couple of initiatives going on at the moment to create the idea of consent receipts. So where, now strictly speaking, that would not be GDPR compliant, because clearly collection of personal data should not occur until you have consent. But in the context of the IoT, where it's very difficult to obtain consent, if the device itself requires a setup that gives you a comms mechanism, you know, the capture of an email address or something, then at least the device can inform the individual user that they have been, data has been collected about them, and give them a receipt of the nature of that data and what's going on. So there's some work going on in that area I think is kind of interesting, but it's the GDPR definitely creates a very interesting problem for Internet of Things and the consent challenge.
Thank you. That's a very good point. Yeah. I'll move on to the next slide, if that's okay, because I'm afraid I have still quite a number to go through. Which is this slide, actually. I haven't gone through this one yet. So, security of IoT devices, the discussion around that came to issues that the basic business model of manufacture of IoT devices was considered by people in the room to be a broken business model. So this refers to things like arguments by IoT device manufacturers that it wouldn't be reasonable to expect them to do a full suite of security testing, because that would make the IoT device too expensive. They would need to be able to sell an IoT device at rock bottom kind of price to be innovative and competitive, and therefore you can't demand security from them. So the general feeling in the room was that this is not a reasonable business model. Also, the concept that every single device must always be connected to the internet directly, as opposed to perhaps a local intranet, is quite questionable, which goes to the third point on the slide, that IoT devices are sort of connected to the third point. That IoT devices, which currently primarily use IPv4, if the number of IoT devices grows as expected by the manufacturers, it will cause a problem with the number of available IP addresses. But apparently a lot of IoT devices are not likely to be compatible with IPv6, so that's going to be a problem. So the general observation was that a lot of the people in the IoT area seem to still follow the software developers mentality of people who are developing toys. It doesn't really matter much if it breaks, because it's not consequential. It's just something that you enjoy having. If it breaks while you're having it, then we can just push out a patch to fix the bug afterwards, similar as they do with most computer games that are released nowadays. However, the problem is that IoT devices are linked to devices in the real world, which are more likely to have physical kinds of consequences if they don't work. In the worst case, they might have life-threatening consequences. The obvious case being things like Tesla's self-driving, or rather driver assist technology, which was also being released as beta versions for people to test drive on the road, and they would send out patches and updates later, which seems rather a dangerous approach. But even things like an IoT garage door opener could potentially, if it has a failure, cause life-threatening problems if by opening incorrectly it snags somebody and causes them to be hanged. So this being a scenario that actually applies to US law around garage door openers, that you're not allowed to have one that works if you're not in visual sight of the garage door, which is also one of the reasons why IoT-based garage door openers actually probably violate regulations in the US on that account, unless they have something that GPS-based makes sure that you can only use them when you're within sight of the door. So the general mentality needs to change. This is connected to the business model issue that IoT devices need to be thought of as devices that have potential serious consequences if they don't work, and therefore you need to do proper testing before releasing. Then this also connects to the collaborative security issue. Obviously, the fact of vulnerable IoT devices that can get hacked and used as part of botnets causes problems for everybody else. So in a collaborative security kind of framework, it's important for everybody else to push IoT manufacturers to have better security. And so then there's also a mention of the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace, the GCSC, which was launched in Munich on the 18th of February, and which ISOC is a member of. I don't actually have further insight into the particulars of what this commission is going to be looking at. But clearly, since it's looking at stability of cyberspace, it will also be addressing issues of things like the botnets that are created using vulnerable IoT devices. Again, I would ask if there's a question with relation to this slide, perhaps just to flag it up immediately.
Ansgar, it's Olivier speaking. There are a couple of comments in the chat from Richard Hill.
Okay, please.
Deals with who mentions regulation, government regulation on these devices. Is that in a further slide, maybe further down? You start talking about it. Well, okay. So we'll wait for his comments after this slide. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so the question was raised whether regulation should be the solution to the IoT security issues. So there was discussion whether business-led best practices to fend off market failure could come in, because there's a fear that too many hacks of IoT devices will cause a failure of the market. So in a sense, soft regulation by expert committees. One would hope that that is starting to be the case. Not yet completely sure. And one of the problems is, of course, that we're dealing with an international operating sphere. A lot of the web cameras, for instance, that were hacked for the Mirai botnet attack on Dyn were from a Chinese manufacturer. So you need really global participation within this collaborative effort to increase IoT security. There's always the argument that if we're pursuing secure devices and the others aren't, they'll be cheaper than us, which connects really to the last point of having a trusted device type of trust mark, so that people can see, this is a device that is safe, so maybe I should use this. One of the problems around thinking of actual introduction of regulation at this point in time, it was thought that it would be difficult to make it time-proof. Regulation that we would be passed for IoT devices of today won't really be relevant perhaps for the IoT devices of next year, simply because the market hasn't matured enough yet to really come out with clear customary practices. On the other hand, there was the observation that probably the threat of regulation from government could be a very good push to indicate to the vendors that there is an urgency for getting their act together and coming up with good standards and soft regulation. So maybe passing actual government regulation wouldn't work at this point in time, but threatening to do so could be very useful. Then, sort of connected to a point I raised on the previous slide about why is it that all of these IoT devices insist on being connected to the global internet, is that there should perhaps be a push for more home management platform kind of approaches, using middleware platforms and OSs so that the IoT devices connect to instead of connecting directly to the internet. We don't really need every single light bulb in the house to be connected to the global internet. They just need to connect to a home management platform, which in turn can be connected to the global internet, so that you can still do whatever you want from your mobile device outside of the house. But you'd have a single point of security management that could be more accessible and more easy to update. So there was a suggestion that the IETF should lead on generating standards, and that perhaps there's a need for licensing of IoT devices, similar as we have licensing for other kinds of devices that have potential for bad consequences. So that you would need an IoT device would need to be tested and get licensed as being sufficiently secure to come onto the market. I think that was the main part on regulation thing. So perhaps, Richard, do you think I covered the points that you were thinking of on the regulation question?
Richard Hill, maybe he's unable to speak. Until Richard gets back to us, I did notice that Jeff had put his hand up a bit earlier, so perhaps should we hand the floor over to Jeff if you wish to intervene?
No, it's okay. The issue was addressed on the following slide. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for this. Richard Hill?
Yeah, sorry. I had to run up from the kitchen. Here I am. No, actually, you said it all. I think this slide here summarizes everything perfectly. It's exactly what we discussed. So I think you've just given a very perfect accounting of the meeting. And also, I think we all agree with the substance of what was said there. So I think this is really good.
Okay, great. Thank you. I do notice a couple of typos.
Thanks for this comment, Richard. And it's worth noting that Jeff has also written in the chat that many companies see owning or defining the standard for the home gateway for IoT to be a huge business opportunity, which means they will fight standardization and countries will support them too. So while it's a good idea, it's going to take a large corporation with global muscle to make this happen. Any thought on that? It's interesting because I do see in a way that, yes, we are seeing also standards for home automation. I know there are several standards around. There are a lot of different organizations working on well, different alliances of manufacturers that often have their own standards, and they're not actually open standards or global standards done by a neutral body, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think that last point is the real issue there, because in a sense, having multiple home management platforms competing with each other is fine and is good. If we've got one from Google competing with one from Amazon, which are two obvious players in this area, but also competing with some other ones, that's probably a good thing. But each of their platforms does need to be open for other manufacturers to be able to hook into them and to use the kinds of standards that they are developing. And even if there are 3 standards, as long as each of those 3 standards is good on the security and is open so that other people can use them and make sure that their device is compliant to it, that would be fine. But as you say, one of the problems is that in an attempt to capture more of the market, there is a tendency to not want to be open with the way in which your platform is running. So yeah, unfortunately, this is probably something that we'll have to wait a bit. It's going to go through its competitive phase before coming to the more stable phase, probably.
Thanks, Angzakar. Olivier speaking. Any other questions or comments from anybody here? Don't see anyone putting their hand up or nobody is shouting their name out. So Ansgar, back to you.
Okay. So on the general discussion that came out of this talk, so one of the observations really was more that governments tend to be more reactive as opposed to proactive in this kind of area. They're going to wait for something to go horribly wrong before trying to step in. And as we said on the previous slide, it's probably not incorrect for governments to not want to regulate too early. On the other hand, how long should they wait? Then within the EU context, another observation was that EU guidelines probably would play a key role in the development of things. And so this is guidelines, not necessarily regulations, but even guidelines will already play an important role in getting more manufacturers to sort of come together into a single kind of direction, which can then develop into a standard that goes across that industry. In order to push the industry to become more security conscious, it's probably going to be a necessity that there's liability, that the industry has to take liability and can't just say that everything is up to the consumer. Because as long as liability lies completely with the consumer, there's no real direct consequences. If there's a vulnerability to the IoT device, there's no consequence to the manufacturer, and therefore there's not enough incentive to do something about it. So there's a need to define collective solutions. Everybody bears their responsibility because everybody is affected directly or indirectly when there are vulnerabilities. There was again an observation that probably we need to think more about self-interest as opposed to relying on good nature. I guess this connects strongly with the idea that there needs to be industry liability, because in that case it becomes self-interest interest to work on security issues. There's the problem that the mindset and the practices vary greatly by region. I mean, we saw this, of course, we see this strongly around issues like privacy and things like the conflicts between the US and the EU around how to handle data sets, the privacy shield issues, those kinds of things. And this will also play within the IoT security area. Insurance industry may be actually one of the ways in which IoT security will become handled or standardized more, because the insurance industry will probably want to impose limits on home devices that are, if they are a potential threat, if they could cause problems. And so then agreements between insurance companies and home security surveillance companies are already in place to a certain extent. So this is primarily to do with IoT devices such as cameras and those kinds of things connected to home security. But potentially, if they are hackable, they turn from being a security device into a vulnerability where, let's say, a burglar may use the camera to just check whether anybody is home before breaking into the place. So potential for the insurance companies to be a player in shaping the way in which IoT security will develop. Then there was the idea that there's a potential for a new kind of profession, the licensed IoT installer, somebody who will come to your home and make sure that all of your IoT devices are properly configured when you install them, that all of the default passwords have been changed to something that's individual to you, etc. And perhaps you will have a contract with them. They will come back once every year to make sure that patches are applied, etc., those kinds of things. Then there were issues, actually this I think connects to a point that Jeff raised earlier, of the ethics of access, use of data collected by IoT devices. And there was the observation that security will also play a key role here, because if this device itself is not secure, then the data can potentially be taken by third parties that you didn't want to have it. Again, the IoT camera being an obvious case, an insecure camera will mean that the video feed can go to the wrong people. I'll just continue on the discussion bit here because this directly connects to it. So the perfect IoT security is probably not a realistic goal. Well, this is, in a sense, perfect security is never really a realistic goal. But so the comparison was made that in the car industry, which is a highly regulated industry, nevertheless it accepts casualties per year in the 5 digits. So instead of saying we're looking for some kind of a standard or regulation that's going to give perfect security, perhaps we need to be looking at what is the point of maximum impact. So how much security will have the best effectiveness as compared to its impact on the ability to innovate and develop this field. So around this kind of idea of we don't necessarily need to be jumping onto too much regulation immediately, was the idea that the immediate urgency should be more on discussion of standards as opposed to immediate regulation, because again, the field itself is still developing. In a sense, these kinds of observations sort of raise that the meeting was slightly in two minds whether or not we need to be moving quickly because there's already a lot of impact versus we need to be waiting a bit more because it's still an immature kind of field. And possibly one of the elements that I think maybe it wasn't listed here directly is that we should probably perhaps not be thinking of IoT necessarily as a single uniform kind of thing, but rather there's lots of different types of devices that can be connected to the internet, and maybe some devices need to be looked at more on the specifics of what it is that they do as opposed to the fact that they're connected to the internet. Certainly when it comes to the question of how much regulation is necessary. Let's see. So yeah, the industry segments probably need separate solutions. There's no single solution for all IoT. And that probably the consumer space will be more difficult to regulate than things like IoT devices that are used within the business space, corporate space, or by government institutions. So IoT devices that are used, let's say, by the rail companies to monitor their network. Regulating them might be easier because you've got a single big customer for them that can impose demands for IoT security on the vendors. So the required devices there was sort of connection to the previous idea of licensing for IoT devices. There was the suggestion that perhaps one should require devices to get a certification before they're allowed to get an IP address assigned to them. So that's really a question of at which level would licensing happen, and is it a license to sell versus a license to connect? So in that case, perhaps you could have, if I want to sell this IoT device, but I don't want to go through the big security check things, then I'll just make one that connects to a home network and not to the global internet. It gives you that kind of an option. So then this really ends the IoT security discussion really ended with some questions concerning ISOC's role in this. So will there be an ISOC position on IoT and security? Where can we steer the conversation? So is there a particular group within ISOC that should be approached, but also are there particular groups outside of ISOC, particular regional bodies, for instance, the EU or large retailers, that would be the ones that we should be approaching if we want to steer conversations around IoT and security. So that was this topic. So I'll open it up again to questions.
Thanks, Ansgar. So if you have any questions, please put your hand up or say your name out or type it in the chat. I have a question on this, Ansgar, and it's a discussion I had at the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum in Guadalajara. And the question was to do with potential potential protocols that IoT devices could have as developed by the Internet Engineering Task Force, where your refrigerator doesn't need to talk to everybody worldwide, and it could just be assigned to talk or speak to a specific part of your apartment, maybe your local hub or something. So a bit of a star system with a star topology with a sort of centralization of services with one controlling node and all the other nodes not needing to speak to anyone else but that specific central authority. And then to develop standards that would allow for these devices to all, and we're talking here standards and protocols, to allow for these devices to be able to talk to each other, but not to talk to anybody outside, or at least then to have a standard by which you can lock these devices. internally. Is that something that was discussed as well, or?
Indirectly, it wasn't necessarily discussed under the heading of it being regulated by this body, but it's the same idea as the idea of having the devices connect through a home management network, or basically don't connect them to the global internet, but rather have them connect to a local intranet only. It's the same concept. It connects also to this question of maybe you need to get certification for what kind of network you're allowed to connect to. So you'd have two different levels of certification. One is certified to connect only to a home network, whereas the other is a certification that allows you connection to the global network.
So Olivia, again, was the impact of IPv6 on this discussed in any way?
It came up earlier around here that a lot of the IoT devices appear currently to not be compatible with IPv6, and this would cause problems.
Yeah, but looking at the future with the
Yes.
ability to assign different types of addresses and globally routable addresses and not globally routable addresses that are just linked local or local to the network, was this seen as maybe a way to secure things more in the future? Or we're just so far away from this yet with the lack of compatibility with IPv6 that it's not even thought about?
No, it wasn't really thought about yet. No.
Jeff, you have your hand up. You have the floor.
Well, just a comment on the IPv6 thing. I'm just wondering if there was more specifics around that. I was actually involved with taking to market the very first embedded TCP/IP commercial stacks, and I can tell you we were IPv6 compliant and ready many years ago, and every customer we sold a TCP/IP stack to, although admittedly we're operating with IPv4, were all built to be IPv6 ready, and the software we sold had to be compliant in that fashion. Now, it may be that the developers of those Internet of Things didn't validate and test the IPv6 in deployment, but I don't see, I'm surprised if there's a significant market issue around IPv6 compatibility due to a lack of capacity in the IoT devices themselves, because, I mean, you know, I was doing this 10, 15 years ago, so I'm amazed if there's still very much around that isn't IPv6 ready.
Yes, thank you. I don't know whether it's a case of the device hardware not being capable or the manufacturer simply not having done any tests on it. I don't have any real insights into it. I think a lot of this is a question of the kind of focus that the IoT device manufacturers have, or that certain devices at least seem to be startups that have an idea for, we need to connect this and this appliance to the internet, and then they're throwing things together. But I don't know anything in depth on this. I don't. Perhaps does Richard have any further insights on this? He was there, and he might be more knowledgeable in the IoT area.
Richard might be in the kitchen. Yes. I was going to add just one thing on this. Actually, when it comes down to customer and equipment, so you know, sort of your little router and so on. Of course, an IPv6 address does require more memory, more buffer space, and I guess that and this is just a wild guess, but for IoT devices, which are for many of them, I would say, so pressurized on price at present already, it probably is just using cheap and nasty chipsets that are, as I said, cheap. And we're talking here maybe even a difference of 20, 30 pence makes a difference for some of these manufacturers. Because it's not only just the TCP/IP stack itself, but it's, of course, the memory chips and the whole chipset and a few other things, which might just push it up by a few pounds. And so maybe they're not seeing this as being a priority at the moment.
Well, certainly the embedded devices I was familiar with were mostly 16 and 32-bit. But even in the 8-bit sector, you know, IPv6 compliance and readiness has been around for a very long time. So I suspect the issue is one of people guesstimating there might be a problem, given that these devices may not have been tested, because, you know, that is where the big cost actually is. It's not so much the implementation, which is certainly a significant issue, but actually, you know, validating and testing it. There's not a lot of IPv6 skill base out there. So while it was interesting, we had lots of customers telling us they wanted it, virtually none of them ever used it, validated it, or tested it, to my knowledge. So there's probably more of an issue of whether or not the IPv6 stack has been sufficiently well tested than anything else. But anyway, okay, just a sort of side issue. I just wanted to sort of see if I could drill into exactly what the problem there was, and it doesn't seem like there's a clearly identified one, just a postulation of a potential problem.
Thanks, Jeff. Richard, you're next.
Yeah, hi. No, actually, I don't have anything to add. I don't recall much of what was said there, and I think that what Jeff has just said summarizes it very well. It's kind of the general problem we have with IPv4, with IPv6, exacerbated by these factors that some of these devices are low cost. As was pointed out in the meeting, sometimes it's manufacturers who really don't know anything about IT. You know, what does a refrigerator manufacturer know about IT except running their SAP or whatever they're running, you know, to their invoicing and production management. And so suddenly they build a device. Well, they have no clue. They're going to purchase the lowest cost chipset, and they have no clue whether it's supposed to be IPv4, IPv6. And then, as Jeff said, even if the thing is dual stack, well, they just don't bother to implement or test the IPv6 stuff, so it's actually not functional when it gets to the consumer. So I think all those are issues that will get sorted out over time. But again, it comes back to what we were saying before. We need industry best practices and voluntary, you know, seals of quality and that kind of stuff. And now I'm going to have to rush off to dinner, but I'm still listening. So if you need me, just give a shout and I'll run back upstairs.
Okay, thanks, Richard. Ansgar, actually, I'm noticing we still have only 10 minutes left on this webinar. And you are at number 13. I see 21 slides, so you might have to speed up a bit.
Okay. So the next point was, so that sort of wrapped up the security part of the discussion. Then we're moving on more into the domain of information rankings, recommendations, and things connected to fake news issues. So the first one of that was on the search ranking technologies. So we got a presentation that sort of had some inside knowledge of how search engine optimization works. And basically his observation was that about 50% of Google staff appear to be involved in things like manual manipulation of search results. And that rules of ranking search results change constantly. It's the algorithm as such is constantly being tweaked, not just, and it's not a single one, but rather there are local tweaks for each region where Google is operating. Fake news suppliers, however, seem to know how to manipulate search results. They've shown that Google is a gameable system. The example that was being presented was picking up on the Holocaust is never happened or something like that. It's the Holocaust real types of results that seem to come up very high on Google search. And if you actually looked at the websites, you could see that the way in which keywords were being used, just even the fact of using the word Holocaust on the website, was targeted to make sure it happens at the beginning of paragraphs, that it gets used in the title, it gets used multiple times, there are images that have it tagged into it, etc. Everything particularly tuned in order to make it so that Google would rank this very highly as a site relevant when the search term Holocaust is being put in, as opposed to historical kinds of websites that give an overview of the horrors of the Second World War. They would usually only have very few mentions of the specific wording of Holocaust, even though they're talking about this topic. So that was sort of an example of how fake news suppliers can game the system by just targeting the wording that is being used, and targeting the way in which the Google algorithm ranks pages based on wording. So Google actively suppresses some unwanted searches, which is sort of connected to the manual manipulation, but also sort of goes counter to some of the narrative that they've used when they were being challenged about these kinds of fake news things coming up high in their results. There was discussion about the role of paid content and advertisements, and the tactics that are available to combat fake news. Basically use the same kinds of methods as the fake news sites use, target the website design more to make sure that it comes up high on the search results. So customization of search results can be established through browsing patterns. So Google follows the kind of browsing patterns in order to customize how they do the search results. But the point is that the thing that Google is targeting is not whether or not people get the truth, but rather whether or not people are going to be happy with the results and keep using Google because they think this is the kind of result they were looking for, which is basically because the business of Google is to keep people on their site as far as their bottom line of income is concerned, keep them on the site where the advertising is. And the final observation there was that personal profiling is the largest source of revenue in the internet market. So that was the brief presentation we had relating to search ranking technologies. Are there questions concerning this? Because this one only has one slide.
Yeah, thanks, Gar. We have 8 minutes left. It's Olivier speaking. There is, of course, a concern among many that the search ranking technology, I mean, today, the overall market for search engines is completely controlled by Google, it seems. And so we don't even have a duopoly. We have a monopoly on search results. Then on the one hand, one talks about network neutrality when it comes down to choice of internet service provider. But what search engine neutrality does one have? It's and there, I certainly know from the discussions I've had in France that some, the governments are worried and they want to launch other search engines. And there are other alternatives, but unfortunately, and I mean, fortunately for Google, but unfortunately for the others, they're not as good as Google. They're not as pertinent as Google. And as a result, they are not used. People seem to just use Google quite willingly. And that just because it does what they wanted to do. But I'm also concerned of the time, so I'll let you get back to the presentation.
Yeah. So that was the search ranking, but then the next presentation was directly connected to that, really, which was looking at editorial responsibility for online content. Since search engine really does editing of which things you find high up in the results. Anyway, that's also part of editorial responsibility. So this one really came down to the question of fake news issues, and I won't read out all of the points on this slide, but rather just the main point of the slide was that fake news is really a bit unfortunate, the fact that it's become a term that is constantly being used, including by myself, because there are so many different types of fake fake news, and you can't really try to deal with all of them in the same way. This was just one particular way of separating out the types into 7 different ones. There are other ways in which you could look at it, but the main point is that there's a big spectrum really of issues, ranging from hardcore propaganda of completely fabricated content to just sloppy reporting that didn't check the background sufficiently. So the presentation really started with looking at some of the contributing factors that have led to the spread of fake news. And so one of the issues, I think, and because this was my presentation, is that the speed of sharing, the fact that sites like Facebook and other social media sites, they effectively monetize by the number of clicks that they're getting. They will be able to sell their service to advertisers for a higher price if they can say that they got a lot of clicks on the thing. So they're really trying to push people to press the like button based purely on the headline without having read the actual article or thought about whether or not they think this is a true story. And other element is a failure to cite content origin, so which makes it difficult to know whether it's a reliable source. Especially since a lot of the media platforms are trying to emphasize the brand of the platform as opposed to the brand of the content provider. This makes it difficult for people to use brand reputation as a way of identifying whether content is reliable, which is how you used to deal with newspapers. So that makes, then there's the issue of blurring of distinctions between content and advertising. In the context of this, it's interesting, there was a strong report by Stanford History Research Group, which did some research into primary, middle, and high school students' ability to even identify whether or not a story was advertising, sponsored content, or native content, and showed that a great number of even high school students were not able to convincingly identify sponsored content, or even know, they didn't even all of them know what sponsored content means, that this means that it's advertising as opposed to that it means that perhaps the platform thinks this is a really important story that you should be looking at. Another element is just the general sense of everything digital is suspect, because we all know that you can Photoshop images and you can do the similar kind of thing with voice and with video, so everything can be manipulated. So if the story that you're seeing is content that you don't agree with, you can just assume that it was manipulated, I think. Then there's the issue of news presentation, celebrity versus expert authority, and this is something that media organizations are they have themselves to blame for a great extent, that they, in order to attract more people, they've moved more towards getting a celebrity kind of person to be interviewed on a topic that they don't even know anything about, or to do the presenting, as opposed to going to the expert who are an authority in the area but aren't somebody that people know already. And then there's the willingness of authority figures to use fake news to further their own aims, and a general issue within reporting of prioritizing getting the scoop, being the first one out, versus doing in-depth reporting, which leads to sloppy reporting and then other sort of aspect of fake news. So then there was an overview of the kind of proposed solutions that have solution proposals that have come out so far. So one of them being the cognitive fact checker, so that people really need some a kind of step to think, does a story make sense? And then the idea of using looking at success successful kind of sites that have been able to really cope with this question of how do we identify whether the content is good or not. And so Wikipedia was actually raised as an example of having done quite a good job, because they've been challenged from the beginning by the other encyclopedias as to whether their content is trustworthy. So they've been building this system for a long time of having a transparent process of news generation, a clear chain of information so that you can see the history of changes and who contributed it, and a constant push that you need to have references, you need to have sources, you need to show where your claim comes from, what it's based on. So Wikipedia was really being pointed at as something that that should be looked at as a source of inspiration. Then there was the suggestion that Alexa-like systems could be used for news-based on different types of fake news. Personally, I'm not actually familiar with how the Alexa system works as far as news reporting is concerned. I get the impression that it's a case of it pulling in information from multiple sites and trying to see whether it gets the same kind of story from multiple places. If that's true, then it's probably estimated as being more trustworthy. But I'll open that to comment as to what this system actually, how the system works. Another approach to dealing with fake news issues was the one of just requiring all news services to register and be licensed by the government. This is the approach that Russia and Malta are doing, and it even includes blog sites that have to be registered in order to be allowed to provide news. Obviously, there's an issue there as to what extent do you trust the government. This clearly opens it up to government-driven propaganda issues. Then there was the suggestion of using a naming and shaming approach. Anybody who publishes fake news should be pointed out that this person is doing sloppy reporting. The extent to which this is going to be successful obviously depends on the extent to which the parties care whether you point them out as being liars. We have an obvious example in the US where that doesn't seem to be helping the naming and shaming approach. And then the people-based approach, sort of an ethics board kind of, which I interpret as being something that would deal more with repeat offenders. So if you can get people, a kind of ethics board, people to come together and say, well, this submitter of news is frequently providing fake news, is not a reliable source, then based on a vote of this board, we will say this person is now no longer allowed to contribute news. It's sort of how it's done in academia kind of way. Whether or not this translates into a more general news is, I think, doubtful. And then another sort of part of proposed solutions is that there needs to be state-funded news production, which would release the news production from the tyranny of advertising. But of course, again, it depends on how much you trust the state to not interfere with how the news is working. But sort of I guess the UK likes to think of itself as having good news because the BBC is a neutral party, because it doesn't rely on, it doesn't need to do things to get its funding. Its funding is already guaranteed. But we also know that there are it doesn't necessarily always run perfectly. There was a general idea that an important element is always going to have to be media literacy. People need to have the skills in order to be able to evaluate whether news content is reliable or not. They have to be able to evaluate that for themselves, because you will not be able to always rely on other kinds of factors doing this checking for you. And so there was quite was that there's a role for ISOC to contribute in generating a kind of media literacy guide targeted at a general education for all ages. And final point there was the obligation to rectify news. So if an error in a news story is identified, or if a news story has been fact-checked and shown to have been false, that there needs to be a requirement to send out a rectification, similar as the case with traditional newspapers. The trick or the problem in this case is how to make sure that everybody who saw the original false news story is actually going to get to see the rectified story, because you don't have the case as with the traditional newspapers that subscribers of the newspapers are going to get the next edition that has the rectification in it. People receive their news via their social media feed or via their friends from the social media. They got the original fake news story with its grand headline, but the correction, it probably isn't very cool to share, so it won't be shared on to people again. So this would need some kind of tracking of seeing who receives the original story so that you can send out the rectified story, but then we have privacy issues with the trackers, etc.
And Scarlett, Olivier, if I could jump in on this actually quickly.
Please do.
When it comes down to rectifying fake news or erratum, sort of errors in news, etc., it's interesting. They have found two worrying trends. The first one is that the news that are outrageous and false spread virally extremely well, when the rectification doesn't spread as well as the original news. So that's one problem they found. The other problem they found in self-regulation, it used to be a time when people could flag an article or flag something that was wrong, that was obviously fake, and that would be then taken off site when a lot of people flagged it like this. But with the recent developments in the United States, when it comes down to political news, it's been a bit of a war of those people supporting the fake news on the one side and those that don't support it. And the thing is not whether the news is fake or not, is whether you agree with these news and you want to spread it, or you don't agree with it and you don't want to spread it. And so they found that some correct news, so not fake, but the right real news, were marked as being fake and were flagged so as for it to be taken down. So we really are in a bit of trouble here. But okay, back to you. I'm well aware of the time.
Yes, just to pick up on that, I totally expected that. I mean, for instance, with the recent efforts by Facebook to so that people could flag up something as fake news, it was obvious that this was also going to be used by people just to flag up anything they disagree with as being fake news, whether or not it's true or fake, just because they don't like the story. So just moving on, so that actually sort of brought us, it connects to what you were also saying. There's an issue that there are different world views, and for many things, it's very difficult or impossible to have an objective fact checker. If it's something that's more to do with an interpretation or a way of looking at the world. And so instead of seeking to counter fake news, the suggestion was that perhaps what we just need to do is to push the story based on our worldview. Effectively, we've got the propaganda on the one side, what we need is counter propaganda. And it becomes public discourse or a kind of media war in which it's a question of who gets to shout loudest. Whether or not this is really the route we want to go in is disputable. But it does connect to the problem that the attempts of saying there must be a software solution are doomed to fail. Software cannot tell what is truth or lie, especially if it comes to things that are sort of open to interpretation, and such software would easily be used again itself as a means of doing propaganda. At best, we can hope for software that can do things like just if the news was something about had a statement of the occurrence of something, that you could check for alternative data points to indicate whether something that something really did occur. Those kinds of fact checking, that where it's just did something happen or not? Is there direct evidence for it? That potentially software could help with, but beyond that, they will. To hope for a software solution is hopeless. So because there is no universal truth, we should just favor diversity of sources and avoid social media monopolies. So this also comes to the question of governments' attitudes or what they're looking at. So as I mentioned in the previous webinar, the UK government is currently doing its inquiry on fake news. Well, it's the Parliamentary Committee that's doing an inquiry. If this committee then makes suggestions for legislation around this, the risk is that governments are going to jump to regulate and produce a disproportionate response that's effectively going to lead to some form of censorship. Trust is something that needs to be established trust is needed in order to establish truth. So you need to build up a track record of trustworthy reporting in order to be able to go to that site as this is a place where I can hopefully get the truth of what happened. So the general outcome of the discussion was that ISOC probably should not engage in trying to find a solution to fake news, because this could be interpreted as censorship, and also because fake news is a broad spectrum of things and you can't have the solution for this spectrum. Instead, everybody should be able to state their own opinion. As far as the fake news issue is concerned, ISA probably should play a role in trying to provide guidance on communicating with legislators who are looking to impose some kind of legislation around fake news, to try and make sure that we don't get overzealous legislation. And that's it for this particular topic. If there are specific questions on this.
Yeah, thank you, Ansgar. It's Olivier speaking. I'm mindful of the time, but Gregory has written in the chat, impressum laws should apply to for social media too. That's why impressum is required for Facebook pages in Germany, apparently. Are you aware of any of this?
I'm not aware of this exactly, or of the particulars of the German situation with respect to Facebook or social media sites. It would be good to catch up on that, actually.
Gregory, would you be able to say a couple of words on this, if you have a microphone?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, very well.
Yes, well, the thing is that it's a bit difficult for the government to implement the law, but it is a requirement that Facebook pages in Germany should have an impressum, and that's why in Germany you have a field on every Facebook page that provides for an impressum, because I think this law has been passed in 2002, and every German-speaking country has an impressum law. And of course, as the issue, as the concern was raised, that if you pass impressum laws for websites, but you can't implement this on social media, then well, why should you have impressum laws? Because as Jeff said, nowadays everybody is a journalist or half a journalist. This is why this issue should be tackled also on social media, and this is what countries like Germany try to do, although this is a question. It's quite difficult to try to implement this on Facebook.
Yeah, and probably this also connects to the whole fight over whether or not Facebook is a media organization and those kinds of issues. Then trying to say that they're not a media organization. So in light of the time, I'll just move on to the final two slides. So we've basically summarized some of the activity action points that were raised. So one is really just a notification of the fact that as this is 25 years of ISOC, there's the celebration around that, which in September there will be celebration in the context of ICOM. Perhaps Olivier wants to say a little bit more about that in a minute. The Internet Hall of Fame nominations are open, and the Internet Future Scenarios consultation is also still open. And as mentioned before, there's the call for further examples on collaborative security. So that's what's happening at the ISOC activities at the global level. And then there at the ERD actions, there's the creation of a special section within the newsletter which will hold news about the chapters. And so there's the email address for sending news items. And then the suggestion that ISOC should try to provide guidance on communicating with legislators who want to impose fake news legislation. Olivier, did you want to say anything about the celebrations in the context of ICOM, or is that something that we'll hear more about later?
Thanks, Ansgar. At present, you know more than I do because you met with the other chapters in Amsterdam. This will be coming up. I mean, it's in September, so we'll have a lot more information closer to that date. And I think what we'll probably do is a follow-up regarding the Hall of Fame nominations, future internet scenarios, etc., etc. So we can get an email.
Okay, great. And then sort of proposed actions from the chapter level. There was the call for a chapter-led initiative to draft some materials, for instance, around the GDPR. So ISOC Romania offered to start some drafting materials around the GDPR and will then invite other chapters to contribute to that. The Turkish chapter has produced some interesting videos on education project with children, and they're going to share these as soon as they are ready. The Armenian chapter ran a survey on trust. So they interviewed 600 people, and the results will also be shared. And then the Dutch chapter wants to propose a website project, which they will present at the chapter's advisory council meeting in early March. Basically, they've been working on quite a lot of things like updated templates and such like. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thanks very much for this, Ansgar. I see Richard Hill has put his hand up. So, Richard, you have the floor.
Yep, I'm back. I just wanted to comment on the last item. We did present it to the chapter's advisory council. And as a follow-up to that, I've sent the message to the full list. So all the chapters have been informed about this. Got a couple of positive feedbacks, but I would really urge everybody to take a look at that and see if they can use it, and if they would like to say that it should be further funded from ISOC. It is partly funded from ISOC, but, you know, of course, one could always use more money. Thanks. I have nothing to do with it, by the way. It's just the Dutch colleagues. I'm just reflecting what everybody said at the meeting. Wow, ooh, this is fantastic. So we decided to put it out to everybody and let them know about it.
Okay, thanks very much for this, Richard. It's Olivier speaking. And as a follow-up to what we have done today, to the webinar today, we will be posting the recording of this webinar on our website at isoc-e.org. I've also put in the chat the follow-up discussions that we will have on the ISOC England policy mailing list. You can subscribe to it by going to isoc-e.org/policy/. And if it doesn't work, then just drop us a note at contact@isoc-e.org. And that's really it for today. So I don't see any other questions in the chat and so on. Thanks to everyone who's joined us today. I'll be contacting Jolie to put this online and so on. And so within the next few days, there should be a YouTube video out of that. And we'll publicize it to everyone. Thanks very much for this, Ansgar. It's been, it's a good webinar, and thanks for your participation in over in Amsterdam. And we'll have to work on a follow-up now, and where do we go from here, basically, because as you rightly said, and as was mentioned, this is just the beginning.
Okay, thank you very much, and sorry for having caused this webinar to become so late.
That's absolutely fine. No worries, it was very interesting. So thanks very much, and thanks to everyone. This webinar is now complete and adjourned. Thank you, and have a very good night, everyone. Goodbye.